Hello. This broadcast is a look at Francis Fukuyama's colossal book on political order. Francis Fukuyama, of course, is very famous for his prominent book that was basically known as The End of History, which was published in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was portrayed as a thesis on the victory of liberal capitalism and the defeat of communism with its central planning economic system. To a large extent, I think this was a simplification. The man did not really argue that liberal capitalism has won and communism and central planning lost. His argument was probably much more sophisticated than that. But irrespective of this, the end result was that his thesis became the end of history. Some sort of an argument that liberal capitalism is the highest, or if you want, the best socio-political and economic system for any society. Now, 25 years or more after the end of history, Francis Fukuyama comes back with a new book. And that book is on the rise and the corrosion of political order. So, of course, such a book will grab a lot of attention, especially that liberal capitalism in that 25 years plus has faced a lot of challenges, not only in the societies that took liberal capitalism in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, in parts of Latin America, but also in the hinterlands of liberal capitalism in Britain, the United Kingdom, and in the United States itself. Some reviewers looked at the new book, the book on political order, as Fukuyama changing his mind, basically saying that, well, history has not ended and therefore liberal capitalism's victory was not really a victory. Again, the man never really said that history ended in that simplistic way. Whether or not he actually changed his mind, I would argue yes, but it is worth to look in some detail at what really he is saying in this colossal work on political order. Francis Fukuyama starts his book with some sort of a joke. He basically says, let's assume that Denmark is political heaven. What does that mean? It means a number of things. It means that it has genuine democracy, genuine representation of political wishes and wants of the vast majority of people in an inclusive, peaceful way. It also means that you have a societal peace. What does that mean? It means that not only the society is functioning in a peaceful way, it means that not only the society is living in a peaceful way, but that the values of peace guide how the society and the politicians who represent the society interact with the world. And in a way, this creates the harmonious relationships that society will have with its neighbors and international stakeholders. 3, it means that society is well governed, which translates into low levels of corruption, low levels of abuse of power. Basically, it is a society well governed. And 4, this political heaven basically means also that the society is functional. Functional means it gets things done. It doesn't just talk about things, it doesn't just debate things, it gets its own policies implemented. Again, Fukuyama is not really saying that Denmark is political heaven, as in all of these 4 criteria are there in a wonderful, beautiful way. No, it is a joke. But there is, as always, some seriousness in the joke. Basically, he says that if you look around you, if you look at the map right now, a number of countries will more or less score very well on these 4 criteria. Let's take Denmark as an example. So that is the joke. That's the way he is trying to draw in the readers at the beginning of this serious book. Political Order, as I said, is a colossal book. It is divided into two major volumes. The first volume is a survey of civilizations. Here, Fukuyama delves into the development of a number of civilizations, how they grew, what were the values upon which these civilizations developed and grew, how did they generate their own wealth, what kind of political systems emerged, what kind of oppositions were there to these values and to these political systems. What kind of structures or some sort of institutions were there in these systems? What narratives, more or less, were used by the political elite in these systems, within these civilizations, to form the identities that people could relate to? Of course, what kind of economic systems, forms of exchanges within the society and between the society and its neighbors, upon which wealth was created in these civilizations. He does all of that for quite a large number of civilizations. And irrespective whether one reader agrees with everything he says or disagrees with everything Fukuyama says, this is not really the important part here. Personally, I find a lot of what he says interesting, but also I disagree with a lot of what he says about a number of civilizations. But the real point here in this survey of the different forms of political structures and what have you is the orders, the political orders that each of these civilizations formed. So in a way, Volume 1 is not just a survey of a number of civilizations. That would make it a political history book. What is relevant to the argument of Fukuyama is some sort of a comparative assessment between the orders that these civilizations gave rise to. There is one interesting point that he focuses a lot on, which is what makes a political order. He zooms in on one specific factor, which is the exclusive use of assertive power. If you want, the exclusive use of power in the sense of violence. Fukuyama here is not very original. He borrows this idea from Max Weber, the very famous German political philosopher, who argued that what makes a state is simply the ability to use power and to have exclusive usage of power within any society. That is what forms a state, as opposed to just a community of people who interact with each other and compete with each other on resources and what have you. This idea is debatable because I think there are a number of examples of states, including ones in today's world, in which the different factions in a society think and agree that they share a state, and yet that state does not have exclusive use of power. Anyway, that's a debatable point, but it is a key element that Francis Fukuyama stops at when he looks at the different orders that he surveys. Another point that Fukuyama stops at is the difference, the distinction between rule of law versus the existence of law. The latter, the existence of law, basically means the ability to have a legal system that regulates interactions, that allocate resources, and through which the state, the power that has that exclusive ability to exert coercion, to use power, to use violence if you'd like, is able to reward and to punish. Effectively a legal system that is a framework for government. Now, this is very different, of course, from rule of law, because that is always based on real checks on power. So in this system of rule of law, the point is not just the ability to use power, whether to regulate, to allocate resources, to reward, to punish. It's rather that the deployment of power is regulated and checked by law. In summary, the difference is law as a framework to govern, or law is a framework in which government operates. And of course, as many political scientists have argued, this check on the usage of power is a fundamental aspect of any democratic system. Now, this might sound like a very basic point. Why would somebody who is very bright and a very well-established writer and thinker, such as Francis Fukuyama, spend so many pages looking at the difference between the existence of law versus the rule of law? Mainly because there is a point he wants us, the readers, to arrive at. And that point is that in some political democratic systems, the rule of law can become so advanced, so elaborate actually, that we end up in a legalized political culture. That is one in which different players in the social system deal with each other on the threat of legal action. Some would say the United States has already arrived at that point. And the real point that Fukuyama zooms on is that this legalized political order puts a brake on functionality. Remember that fourth point he highlighted early in the book. So, a long story short, in his view, in this specific part of the book, rule of law is great and wonderful, but the question that he raises, what if it keeps evolving and developing and growing, and therefore arrives at a point at which it renders the entire political system dysfunctional? This point takes us to the second volume of Political Order, which focuses on the decay of political order. The choice of the word decay, I think, is important, is telling. Decay signifies slow erosion, slow fall, weakness from within. And here we do not need to be super smart readers to see that what Fukuyama draws our attention to is the United States, or rather that the level of dysfunctionality that exists in the political order of the United States, at least when he was looking at that in the second decade of the 21st century, that could well lead to a decay. I think the argument and the discussion that Fukuyama spends quite a lot of time actually on here is one of the most interesting, one of the most riveting within this book. However, having said that, I think here we have a bit of a disconnect between Volume 1 and Volume 2, in the sense that in Volume 1, Fukuyama takes us on this great long survey and tour of different civilizations, in which the fundamental point is the differences between these different civilizations. In the second volume, when he discusses decay in a political order, to my mind at least, the example of the United States in its very recent history is very much alive in his mind. So you can say the vision in the first book was very wide when it looked at political orders across history or throughout history, but in the second book, the vision became primarily focused, narrow if you want, on the United States in the period over the past 25 years or so. Still a very valuable discussion, but I wanted to highlight that point because it is, I think, a key difference between the first volume versus the second volume of this book. Another key element of the decay in a political order that Fukuyama delves into is what happens to the middle classes. The middle classes, of course, are a sacred cow, if you'd like, to political scientists. 2,000 pages or so. Important theories in political development, the modernization theory, is anchored on the idea that the middle classes really generate democracy from within a society, that the middle classes are the bedrock of democracy in any society. And with a huge simplification, the theory goes that, quite simply, that the bigger the middle classes become, the more they start to demand certain rights. Usually these rights start with property rights, that basically no one can take your home from you because you have invested a lot of money, quite a substantial percentage of your wealth, into that home, and therefore you want to make sure that there is a legal system that protects you from the executive, from the authority, hence property rights. And the idea is very clear, of course, that the more you gain economic rights, the more you want to be represented, the more you want to have a say in decision-making, or at least some sort of ability to monitor the government's decision-making, and voila, you have the beginning of political representation, and therefore you see how this could evolve in this theory into some form of a democracy. At least some sort of a balanced political system that could emerge into a democracy. Again, the fundamental aspect of this modernization theory is the middle classes, is that you do have in a society a very large group of people whose income, whose assets are growing, take them beyond the stage of economic necessity, give them new aspirations, and give them time, actually, for leisure and for the materialization of these aspirations. Those are obviously not the elite, the very rich at the very top, but they are also not those who are at the very lower ends of the social ladder, who are stuck in trying to make means meet ends. Those who are stuck just to meet the basic necessities. So it's not the very top, it's not the very low, it's the middle. Again, Fukuyama here is not also very original, because so many writers, and especially political scientists, have used modernization theory to try to explain the rise of democracy in different parts of the world. The problem, however, is that in most of these cases, the theory is almost perfect when you look at Anglo-Saxon societies. Britain, especially England, and the United States, and especially the early parts of the United States, the first 100, 150 years, in which the American history was very much focused on the eastern coast of the US and the very beginning of moving beyond the initial 13, 14 colonies. Modernization theory becomes quite debatable once you try to understand other experiences with democracy, especially in Europe. But the real problem with modernization theory actually is not just the history of it. It is what happened also in the last 25 years since Fukuyama wrote his End of History book. As I said earlier, we already have seen liberal democracy facing challenges in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, in parts of Latin America, let alone in Britain and the United States now. So the point that Fukuyama delves into, which is also a question for us as readers, is that if you look at the evolution of the middle classes and the growth of their demands from the perspective of the modernization theory as a factor that contributed to the rise of stable, powerful, democratic political orders, can we say that today economic changes, technological changes, threats to the sustainability of someone's status as a middle-class person, changes in the job market, future trends in what jobs actually will be like, all of these factors that we can think of as potential threats to the middle class, does all of that mean that the thinking, the aspirations of the middle classes are changes, and therefore that is generating part of the decay that we are starting to see in political orders across the world? So basically, are the economic and technological changes leading to this political decay? Or is the theory itself that middle classes development, growth, aspirations, wants, and how all of that creates a stable political order is only applicable in the Anglo-Saxon model and maybe a few others, but is not really a rule for the rise of a stable political order worldwide. I hope you see my point here, that the first one says, yes, this is the theory, it's applicable everywhere, and therefore changes now to the economic systems, the technological world are threatening the middle classes, and that is causing or contributing to the decay that we are seeing in political orders. Versus the other idea that the theory itself is wonderful, but in a very limited number of societies. And therefore it is not necessarily the cause or a main cause for the decay we are seeing in different parts of the world. Of course, in these types of discussions, there's no decisive answer. But this part of the book that more or less revolves round the middle classes, the remnants and the echoes of the modernization theory, I think is also another very valuable part of the contribution that Francis Fukuyama puts forward, especially given all of the talk these days on populism and the rise of populism and what it means and its causes and where it will lead different societies to. I also think that this discussion in this part of Volume 2 of Political Order is very relevant to another valuable, very valuable discussion going on in the world right now, and other books were written on it, on the rise of inequality, economic inequality particularly, but of course which translates immediately into social and political inequality in different parts of the world. So if you link the discussion that Fukuyama has on the middle classes, on the modernization theory, with these different discussions on the rise of inequality, partly because of the technological changes, blah, 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 but also because of the decay of political order in certain places, you start to have a very interesting web of factors, network of factors affecting each other. Some sort of a vicious circle in which technology, economics, and politics have been feeding each other, at least for a decade now. Here, I do not want to come across as someone very negative and very pessimistic about the future of the middle classes and what that means for economic inequality, whether it will go up or down, and the consequences on political systems. What I'm trying to do here is highlight certain discussions, such as the one in this book, as worthy of reflection, particularly given the major political changes we are seeing right now, whether in Britain, in the United States, or parts of Europe. So to finalize, the book does not really answer the two main questions it raises. It does not really tell us what leads to the rise of a stable, powerful political order, or what contributes to the decay of such an order. But in these almost over 2,000 pages or so, Fukuyama does something very good for an author and a thinker. He throws at us well-constructed ideas and arguments. It does not mean that these arguments are necessarily correct, or that anybody who will read the book will say, wow, these are wonderful arguments. Far from it. Many people will disagree with many arguments in this book, but it is a very rich background to some of the most important political trends going on in the world right now.